Oh, hello. Good to see you. My name is Zach. Well, I've just been sitting here, but since you're here, might as well talk to you. As you can see, I'm out here in the desert, and in these kinds of situations with nothing but sand, wind and silence, you start to think about what really matters. What really matters. One question that's been on my mind is whether Mike Winger is someone we can trust when it comes to biblical teaching. Mike Winger is a YouTube person who reaches millions of people. That's a lot of people. He's pretty much commented on every single topic possible, and many people really care what he has to say. At the same time, others have questioned how trustworthy he is. Today, I want to talk about that. Now, you might be asking why it's important to ask if Mike Winger is trustworthy. This is, of course, not just a video aimed at bashing Mike Winger. Being able to trust a Christian YouTuber matters because many viewers rely on them as a primary source of teaching, especially in areas where they don't have the background to fact check everything themselves. If a creator misrepresents opposing views, avoids the best arguments, or presents ideas with more confidence than their expertise allows, followers can easily be misled without even realizing it. Since faith and theology directly shape people's beliefs, decisions, and spiritual lives, the trustworthiness of a teacher is just as important as the accuracy of their conclusions. Now, just a reminder, we are not asking if Mike Winger is right. He's right about a lot, obviously. The question for today is if he is a trustworthy source for information. What makes someone trustworthy, you might be asking yourself. See, when I try to establish if someone is trustworthy online, I ask a few key questions. Can they summarize the views of people they disagree with correctly? And when they argue against them, do they actually respond to their points rather than avoiding the best arguments? Do they get emotional in debates, which usually means using less of the thinking part of the brain? Or do they stay clear-headed? Do they insult others or call them names? Or instead represent both their opponents and their own view fairly and with the best arguments available? I also look for whether they take critique seriously. Are they willing to admit, I'm not an expert here, and know when to be confident and when not to be? Naturally, even the smartest people make mistakes, of course. A trustworthy person is willing to correct those mistakes when they make them. Formal education is also helpful too when finding out if someone is trustworthy. If they have a degree from an accredited school, it shows that someone knowledgeable has signed off on how much they know, and ideally, you will be taught how to look at original sources and do research. First, let's look at education. Does Mike Winger have any formal education in biblical studies, philosophy, history, sociology, or even journalism? No, sadly not. This doesn't mean he isn't a trustworthy source of information, but I've realized that it is very rare for someone to be trustworthy in regard to topics like philosophy, history, the Bible, without being formally trained. Next question is morally ethical. Is he morally ethical? I actually think so. Well, I have heard Mike Winger say some things that may be harmful for others. I have never seen Mike do something unethical, and it is easy to tell that he really cares about people. Is he trustworthy with money? The next question. I'm not aware how reliable he is with money, but he actively tells people not to donate to him, that he already has enough money. Anyone that flat out says not to donate to him gets a big green checkbox in my eyes. While you might say it's easy to do given how he at minimum makes six figures, it still speaks volumes about his integrity that he discourages unnecessary donations and doesn't exploit his audience for financial gain. being morally ethical and not just doing YouTube for money doesn't necessarily mean one is trustworthy in regard to teaching and information, but it would be a really big flag if not. In other words, if you believe in his mission and he needed money in order to do it, I'd say that makes great sense to support him. All great things come to an end though. While Mike has a lot of positives that would make me more than happy to let him take care of my cat if I had one, I cannot say the same about his trustworthiness on what we will talk about. And let me remind you, some of these things he's right about, but that doesn't mean the information he gives you to support his conclusion is correct. With that being said, let's talk about some things that I don't think it would be justified to simply trust him on. If you are interested in going in detail on why I say what I say, you can check the description for links that show what I'm talking about. First, friends of the channel will know his comments on the complementarianism versus egalitarianism discussion were, to be quite frank, incredibly bad. While he at least referenced scholars and most of the time gave the best arguments for his position, complementarianism, he routinely misrepresented the other side, called them names, implied many of them were being deceptive, ignored the best arguments against his position.
What's weird is that this quote that Mike just put on the screen and that he's using for his argument, that comes from a paper that Douglas Moo wrote in around 1981. And Philip Payne responds to this argument in a book which Mike has and he even shows on screen in this video. Yet Mike never presents the counter-argument that Payne presents to Moo's argument.
This was almost constant, all while portraying himself as an authority figure. Sometimes he would read a book and just conveniently skip to the next page when he is presenting an argument, one that would defeat his position. Another key thing people often miss is that in the middle of Mike talking bad about egalitarians, it's very noticeable that Mike is very emotional about it.
You've just given a bit too much trust in the scholars that you've picked. I don't know how else to put it. Sorry, don't mean it to be personal at all.
I will not attempt to psychologize why that is specifically, but this is important. From a neurological perspective, when someone gets emotional, the thinking part of their brain is not able to function well. It essentially just turns off. Obviously, someone who cannot think as well in these positions will be less trustworthy. Next, we have penal substitution. In this, you can pretty much say the exact same thing, except he actually insulted his opposition more on this topic.
We just need to recover what is so incredibly obvious because it is being preached against by some well-meaning individuals and some people who are just poop faces.
Still, while doing the same misrepresentation, ignoring the best arguments, the best scholarship, very emotional, etc., just like we heard from the last one. The next example I have for you is one of his early video series. This is one of the very first ones that I watched, and I've been a fan of his a long time, where he argues the book of Daniel is proof of prophecy, where he basically says that the only reason people reject that Daniel is prophecy is because people don't want to believe it is true.
And this is why critics, in response to Daniel, because there's a lot more prophecies we haven't even got to yet in Daniel, this is why they attack the date of Daniel and say it wasn't written until 165, 175 BC. That's what they say.
They don't want prophecy to be true, and that defines how they come to the conclusion on the Bible. Coming from someone like myself who has read lots of commentaries on the book of Daniel and talked to these experts personally, to me, this comment from him shows how Mike is completely unaware of basic scholarship on the topic of Daniel. There are plenty, and I mean plenty, of Christians that take a 2nd century BC date of the book of Daniel, and it is not as if Christians have an issue with prophecy being fulfilled. Like, that would be crazy for a Christian to think that and have a problem with prophecy being true. What? That doesn't make any sense. See, Mike conveniently never mentions this long list of Christian scholars that make a long list of arguments saying that the book of Daniel is not written while Daniel was in Babylon. He often likes to frame things as in us versus them mentality, which promotes tribalism, and in this instance, it is us, the Christians, and them, the atheists. Of the few arguments he does address, of course he misrepresents those as well. The next one will be surprising for some people. He did a long video or two on Benny Hinn. And while Benny Hinn probably deserves a lot of the hate, Mike was somehow extremely uncharitable in his views, misrepresenting things, extremely emotional, and honestly just acted like things were worse than they actually were. Here's one example.
Shh. No, don't bring them up unless they're healed. I'm not the healer, the Lord is the healer.
That's right.
Dear Marie, she's not healed yet. I will not let them up unless they're healed.
Scumbag.
Here, Benny Hinn is asking people that have been healed to come on stage, and some lady tries to come on stage anyways. Obviously, with an audience of thousands of people, it's a terrible idea to just have people come on stage whenever they want. Next, we have the topic of philosophy. Why I'm not an expert in the slightest. There are some clear times where Mike is just way too confident about things he knows little about. For example, the Kalam cosmological argument, or the moral argument may be a good argument for God, but Mike acts like the conversation is way more simple than it is, and he misleads his audience by not being aware of what detractors have to say about them. We have to be honest that you aren't going to be an expert in philosophy from watching a William Lane Craig video, and it appears that is the extent of what Mike knows about philosophy. Also, another example is his treatment of the problem of evil. Mike just doesn't take it as seriously as he should, which actually just pushes people away from Christianity, as the argument is most powerful when someone is going through a tough time. Imagine if you were going through the worst moment of your life, struggling with how God could let your little sister die, and Mike Winger acts like you're stupid for being upset at God.
I have heard over and over crazy atheists, and this is crazy, saying that theoretically if they died and stood before God and found out God was real, that they would shake their fist at God and they would say, "How dare you," to God.
Hypothetically, he could be right that it isn't as strong as he thinks it is, but that's just not how you respond to such a thing. In this case, not only does it seem like he's untrustworthy as far as his response, the information that he gives, but he's also untrustworthy in regard to the level of thought that we should be putting in. He's conveying that it's not as serious, not as important, not worth stressing on for Christians, that it's not worth considering. And that's just not true. When you get in those emotional situations, oh, trust me, it's going to be extremely difficult. And that argument is going to be it's going to seem extremely strong. So it's extremely important that we as Christians prepare people and realize that people really struggle with it, even Christians. So it's something that you need to really take seriously. Now, I personally believe that many progressive Christians have a lot of just darn silly beliefs. But at the same time, that doesn't justify making even worse arguments against them. It doesn't justify misrepresenting or treating them like they are the enemy.
It's all because of Jesus. So I never go wandering around in the Old Testament without Jesus. So at any given moment, I can pause and I can say, Jesus, what do you think of that? And Jesus can say to me, Brian, what do you think of that? Well, it seems to me, Jesus, that in the light of what you taught us, that we have to rethink this passage. And I think Jesus says, amen.
Bobblehead Jesus says, amen. What do you think, Jesus? Well, what do you think, Brian? Well, Jesus, in my amazing wisdom of life, I think that the Bible's wrong here. And it said, yes, Brian, you're very wise. You know, that's progressive Christianity in a nutshell.
Okay. He concludes here. That's progressive Christianity in a nutshell. Again, he begins with insult comedy. He caricatures, straight up caricatures, misrepresents what Brian Zahnd says. What is Brian Zahnd actually saying here? Brian Zahnd is describing reading scripture through Christ, through the life and teaching and modeling of Christ. For example, Psalm 137, is it sometimes blessed to take the infants of your enemies and to dash their brains against the rocks, which the psalmist says. In cases like this, what you do is always read guided by Christ, his life and teaching. So, for example, Jesus said, "It has been said, hate your enemy, but I say, love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you. Don't forgive 7 times, forgive 77 times." Time and again, what we see Jesus doing is offering us a new perspective on the law and unlimited forgiveness and love and the embrace of your enemies, not just your friends and the insiders, but your enemies. So when you read the psalmist saying these really shocking things about bathing your feet in the blood of the wicked or dashing their babies against the rocks, you should read those texts Christologically through Christ.
Next, we have kenosis.
The kenosis says that God, the Word, right, he became flesh, and he basically ceased being God at that point.
Okay, so that's just insanely false, and anybody who tells you that's what canonical Christology teaches has absolutely no clue what they're talking about.
Here we have Mike speaking super confidently, but not really knowing much about it. Then there is the Genesis topic. In the past, Mike Winger has said that he doesn't hold a specific view on the age of the earth. I'm not up to date on his current opinion, but I was extremely impressed to hear that he is aware of the views of people like Joshua Swamidass and William Lane Craig, and didn't even call them a heretic. About 8 months ago, he did a video simply going through a bunch of views on Genesis. He did a pretty good job explaining the different views, and even said they could all be Christians. He seems extremely level-headed on this topic. There is still hope for Mike. On topics related to Jesus and the Old Testament, you're basically wasting your time watching. I'll leave it at that. On the other hand, Mike is incredibly misinformed on his understanding of the gospel. His Passion Translation commentary has some good aspects because he got real scholars on, but even then I've heard Mike misrepresent the translation and the author. I've actually shared Mike's commentary on divorce and remarriage to friends of mine. While I don't think it's incredibly well researched, he mostly is right on a lot of his conclusions and gives us some okay good arguments. Then there's the homosexuality series. This is one of those ones where it was made at the early stages of his channel, and he's actually become a better researcher since then. So many of his early videos are actually a little bit worse than the normal ones you watch today. So yeah, don't expect him to deal with the best arguments against his view there, or even be a trustworthy source of arguments on his own position. Then there's a few where he comes to the right conclusion and his arguments are okay, but not great, like when he responds to Calvinism or presuppositional apologetics. He was actually pretty nice in response to those views from what I can remember. So yeah, in summary, pretty much every time he disagrees with someone, there's a good chance he'll be uncharitable, misrepresent others, speak extremely confidently, etc. This is why coming at these topics when you are not emotionally charged is so important. When you are upset at someone or someone else, I'm not even kidding, on a neurological level, your mind literally is not working as well, which I think in these cases explains most of what we see from Mike. When he is not as emotional, he's actually going to be thinking a lot better. That, and he just doesn't really have the skills for quality biblical studies or philosophical argumentation that is needed to be a good Bible interpreter, a good teacher. There are some things where he does seem to maybe give closer to the best arguments, but it only happens when it's his view, and this would be things like complementarianism, maybe his commentary on Mark, and maybe on Hebrews, maybe. Then there's what I see as the most troublesome thing. See, when Mike Winger gets critiqued, he does not respond well, like at all. He either ignores things that blatantly disprove what he's saying, he will mock it, like he actually just mocks the view, it doesn't matter what it is.
Well, what do you think, Brian? I think that the Bible's wrong here, and it said, yes, Brian, you're very wise.
Mickey and his pals came up with the doctrine of penal substitution. God has wrath. He doesn't know what to do with it. Where's he going to put it?
You will often see him watch just a few minutes of a video that critiques him. He chooses the most petty thing to respond, and then he just doesn't watch anything else. He just gives up. It's almost like he's actively looking for a reason not to watch people that disagree with him. I've seen this in numerous examples. You might be asking why this is important. See, I see no evidence that he has any accountability for what he says. His audience is mostly full of people that aren't experts in the Bible, so they have no idea when he makes mistakes or misrepresents the opposition. And Mike essentially ignores any criticism. So his audience has basically no chance of ever learning there is anything else out there. Not only is Mike untrustworthy when talking about things he disagrees with, but I see no evidence that he's really making any attempt at all to allow himself to be corrected. Even in videos where people critique him, he's not asking for clarifying questions. He's not asking for more resources, for additional arguments. How can you ever expect to be a trustworthy source of information if you don't take people you disagree with seriously? How would you ever know if you are wrong if you don't allow yourself to even consider critiques? Unless Mike just coincidentally happens to be right about everything he believes, that essentially guarantees he will be wrong about things, and his audience has no way of knowing it. So, is Mike Winger trustworthy? The answer is complicated. On the one hand, Mike seems to be a genuinely caring, ethical person who isn't in ministry for the money and clearly wants to help people. That earns him respect. But when it comes to trustworthiness as a source of information, the picture changes. Again and again, when Mike tackles controversial topics, he misrepresents opposing views, avoids the best arguments, speaks with more confidence than his actual knowledge allows, and often reacts poorly to critique. He has no formal training in biblical studies, history, or philosophy, and while that doesn't automatically disqualify him, you can really tell that it affects his argumentation. It seems that he has not learned the skills that he needs if he wants to read the Bible reliably. In short, you may often agree with his conclusions, but the reasoning he gives to get there is frequently unreliable. The biggest concern is that Mike doesn't show accountability to scholars or critics, which means his audience has little way of knowing when he's wrong or misrepresenting others. That is not a deal breaker for watching him, but it does mean you shouldn't simply trust him as your main source for theology, philosophy, or even biblical studies. Use him as a starting point if you like, but always go check the original sources and other scholars for yourself. If Mike Winger wanted to become a more trustworthy teacher, there are several things he could do. First, he could engage more fairly with opposing views, representing them accurately instead of oversimplifying or mischaracterizing them. He could also take critiques of his videos more seriously, interacting with the strongest counter-arguments instead of dismissing or mocking them. Inviting experts to review his notes and even preview his videos before posting would add accountability and help catch errors he might miss on his own. Alongside this, he could be even clear about the limits of his knowledge, openly acknowledging when he lacks the expertise and encouraging viewers to consult primary sources or trained scholars. A greater investment in formal or informal training in areas like Hebrew, Greek, history, or philosophy would also strengthen his credibility. Finally, dialing back the emotional tone and approaching controversial topics with more calmness and charity would help ensure his reasoning comes across as careful rather than reactive. None of this would require him to change his conclusions, but it would make his teaching more reliable and worth taking seriously. Yeah, that leaves us with the last thing, the tier list. While Mike does some things good, I think the negatives greatly outweigh the positives. So I would put him on the F tier, right next to Mr. Sensationalism. I would not consider Mike a trustworthy source of information on pretty much anything. He does good things, like going after people that are clearly doing bad and teaching bad, but at the same time, we just need better quality. Let me know if you disagree. Thanks so much for watching, and make sure you like and subscribe for more videos like this.